I come from many generations of farmers. My grandparents, their parents before them, and theirs before them, going back and back, spent their lives working the soil in Kerala, South India. They grew everything from coffee to rubber to mangoes to jackfruit to cashews to coconut. They lived entirely off the land, growing what they needed for food and selling the rest. My maternal grandfather, who I had the privilege of knowing briefly as a child, he died when I was 10, was a very meticulous man and farmer. He cherished order and precision. Every year, he would plan out the family's extensive vegetable garden. He'd prepare the soil, dig perfect holes in neat, symmetrical rows, and carefully plant the seeds he had chosen and sorted. But when he was done, when he'd gone elsewhere to tend the cows or the goats, my grandmother would go into that garden, bearing fistfuls of mixed seeds, vegetables, flowers, herbs, spices. Without a care in the world, she'd throw those seeds everywhere, basically planting a riot between my grandfather's orderly rows. Perhaps she was more attuned to the growing appetites of their 6 children and knew that my grandfather's modest spread of tomatoes and green beans would not cut it. Maybe her love for color, fragrance, and texture were too powerful to suppress, and she just had to plant jasmine, hibiscus, geraniums, and marigolds in the middle of his carrots and peppers. Maybe she thought her husband's fastidiousness was funny, and she took some delight in ruffling his feathers. Whatever the case, every year my grandfather's well-disciplined garden would sprout into a fragrant, multicolored jungle, chaotic, abundant, and beautiful. In our gospel reading this morning, Jesus describes a sower who reminds me very much of my grandmother. This sower, Jesus tells the crowds, isn't cautious and careful. He does not obsess over metrics. He does not even try to be efficient and organized. Instead, he sows. In fields and meadows, back alleys and playgrounds, strip malls and parking lots, all day long he grabs fistfuls of seeds and scatters them onto rooftops, haystacks, cobblestones. No matter how many seeds spill through his fingers, he has more. No matter how many fall into poor soil, he keeps on sowing. If anything, the sower seems a bit absurd, a bit reckless, a bit wasteful. I imagine if my grandfather had met him, he would have asked the sower a few choice questions. Shouldn't you be more discriminating? Why aren't you holding a few seeds back in reserve in case you need them later? What kind of ridiculous gardener leaves his harvest to chance? I imagine the sower would have smiled at these questions and then kept sowing, flinging seeds left and right in pure joy. Why? Because that is who he is, a generous sower, an extravagant sower, a prodigal sower. For us, then, the question at the heart of this parable is a simple one. How are we going to respond to the outrageous generosity of God? As we stand in the company of the seemingly reckless sower, seeds of grace, mercy, justice, and love coming at us from every direction, what are we going to do? Who are we going to become? How are we going to receive these seeds? Notice that the question is not, how am I going to make myself good enough to deserve the seeds? How am I going to earn the good news the sower carries? This is an important distinction, one that many people, both inside and outside the church, stumble over. I'll confess that I spent many years hearing this parable without noticing the generosity of the sower. It didn't even occur to me to think about him. I was so busy thinking about myself, worrying about what kind of soil I was. Was I rocky? Was I thorny? Was I shallow? What could I do to become good, fertile, loamy soil, soil worthy of the sower's attention? How could I earn a few little seeds of my own? Maybe, in big or small ways, you have approached this parable in the same way. Instead of reading it as the parable of the sower, you have read it as the parable of the 4 soils. In response, you've designed all sorts of clever and exhausting self-improvement projects to get rid of your stones and thorns. You've believed in your heart that the sower is withholding from you, waiting for you to clean up your little patch of earth and make it fertile. You have compared your soil to the soil of others, as if you are in competition with them for the love and acceptance of the sower. If any of this is true for you, please begin by hearing the good news at the heart of this parable. It is first and foremost a story about the sower. It is a story about the character of God, God's love, God's delight, God's extravagant, over-the-top generosity. It's a story about a sower who has already hallowed all the soil, who has covered every corner, nook, and byway of the earth, of our hearts, of this community, of this universe, in precious, life-giving seed. All the terrain, even the hidden, shadowy terrain that you fear is beyond redemption, belongs to God and is beloved of God. The seed is already yours. You don't have to earn it. So again, the question that matters: how are we going to respond to the staggering generosity of the sower? Perhaps we can begin by asking ourselves if we are cultivating such generosity in our own lives. As I imagine this sower walking in and through the varied terrains of the world, I can't help but notice my own contrasting stinginess. The truth is, I don't always believe that there's enough goodness to go around. I look out at this world's brokenness and I feel defeat and despair rising up inside of me. I don't begin with the confident assumption that the seed is trustworthy, that it can accomplish exactly what God wills for it, no matter where it lands. I don't lean into God's endless ability to soften hard ground, clear away rocks, and cut through the most stubborn of thorns to make way for a harvest. I'm afraid to let seeds fall into the earth and die, because death involves pain and risk, and I fear both. In part, I struggle with this parable because I read it through the lens of my Western individualism. I forget that the earth I stand on is your earth as well. I assume that I can tend to my own soil without attending to yours and without asking you for help with mine. As if the cultivation of my spiritual life is a personal affair and not a communal one. If we truly want to follow in the footsteps of the generous sower, we need to ask ourselves much bigger questions. What conditions in our pews, streets, towns, in this country, what conditions are inhibiting God's seeds of love and justice from flourishing? Where in the world are political, economic, racial, and cultural thorns choking out the life of God's people? Where are children and adults feeling unrooted and unsafe, wrenched into exile from the soil of their homelands so that growth has become impossible? How might we at St. Mark's those whose entanglements and thorns have left them bleeding? How can we provide shelter for those who don't have anywhere safe to put down new roots? How can we lift away the heavy stones that our neighbors cannot lift by themselves? Imagine how our witness as 21st century Christians would change if we were known first and foremost for the absurd generosity of Jesus' sower. for our communal tending of the earth's scorched soil, for our joy when the birds come along and feast on our seeds, for our pure lavishness, not for our caution, apathy, and judgment. The truth is, we are living at a moment when the world needs sowers who will err on the side of wastefulness, sowers who would rather lose a bunch of seeds to difficult terrain than withhold a single one from a hungry earth. The amazing thing about this parable is that at some deep intuitive level, we recognize its wisdom. We know that Jesus is telling us the truth. We have seen it with our own eyes. We know that the most elegant gardens sometimes fail, while profusions of scrappy, weedy wildflowers push through cracks in sidewalks and brighten depressed neighborhoods. We've seen how new life can spring from the most shriveled places in our lives, places we've given up on, places we've assumed are hardened beyond hope. We have witnessed inhospitable environments being altered by love. We know that joy follows from selflessness and generosity, not from caution and miserliness. We know that we can be many types of soil at the same time, and that our complexity is no threat to God. In short, we know that dirt can be transformed, but the work of transformation is not easy. Good soil comes alive through the decomposition of dead things. Old patterns surrendered, old addictions overcome, old idols relinquished. Good soil requires compost, coffee grounds, eggshells, rotten vegetables, trash, which is to say, surrender, which is to say, death, which is to say, death and resurrection. When my grandmother died a few years ago, everyone who knew her had a story to tell about her skill with the soil. She could make anything grow. She could take any ugly corner of the earth and transform it into Eden. And over her 101 years of life, there was never a time when she did not have nourishment to share from her gorgeous, crazy gardens. My prayer for us at St. Mark's is that seeds of love, mercy, justice, humility, honor, and truthfulness will fall through our fingers in such appalling quantities that even the birds, rocks, thorns, even the shallow, sun-scorched corners of the world will burst into colorful, riotous life all around us. My prayer is that we, like my grandmother, will be jungle makers. We don't have to do this alone. The prodigal sower stands before us always, hands outstretched, fingers covered in seed, saying, live, flourish, grow, thrive. Not because you have to earn the good news, but because its astonishing abundance is already here and already yours. Let all who have ears to hear listen. Amen.